It all started with a quick stop for cold medicine, a 5-minute errand that turned into a nightmare. Valerie Brooks, a 54-year-old teacher, walked into a neighborhood store and ended up in handcuffs, humiliated before strangers. But what happened next shook the entire city. You won't believe how fast the tables turned. Watch until the end, hit subscribe, like this video, and share it. Because this is a story everyone needs to see. It had been one of those days that felt like it stretched for a week. The kind of day where every minute dragged like an hour, and every responsibility piled on top of the last until you could barely remember when it started. Valerie Brooks, 54 years old, had been teaching for more than 3 decades, but somehow the job felt heavier these days. Her day began before sunrise, coffee gulped down at the kitchen counter, lesson plans reviewed in the soft light of dawn, her worn leather satchel already filled with stacks of papers waiting for red ink. By the time the morning bell rang at Jefferson High, she was running on stubborn willpower and a teacher's practiced smile. The day was a blur of back-to-back classes, managing restless 9th graders, calming anxious seniors worried about college applications, and dealing with a surprise parent meeting that ran almost an hour longer than scheduled. By the time she packed up for the day, it was nearly 7 o'clock at night. The school hallways were dark, the echo of her steps the only sound left. Her back ached from hours of standing. Her throat felt raw from talking over chatter, and her eyes burned from staring at papers and screens. The only thing on her mind was getting home to her little brick house on the east side of town, kicking off her shoes and collapsing into her armchair with a hot cup of tea. But there was one thing she couldn't put off. She needed cold medicine. The tickle in her throat had been growing all afternoon, and she knew from experience that if she didn't treat it now, she'd be flat on her back by the weekend. The neighborhood convenience store was just 5 minutes from her house, a place she'd visited countless times over the years. It sat at the corner of a quiet intersection, the flickering neon open sign glowing against the dark Georgia night. The air outside was thick and warm, clinging to her skin even after the sun had been down for hours. She parked under one of the tall light poles in the lot, noticing the way the light buzzed faintly overhead, moths swirling lazily around the bulb. Inside, the store smelled faintly of floor cleaner and fried food from the deli counter in the back. Valerie moved with the slow, careful pace of someone who had nothing left in the tank, but still carried herself with quiet grace. Her students often teased her about how she could walk into a chaotic classroom and settle it with just her posture alone. Tonight, even bone-tired, that same dignity was with her. She made her way to the cold medicine aisle, scanning the rows until she found her usual brand. She didn't linger, just grabbed the box and headed for the counter, fishing her wallet from her bag. The clerk at the register was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, slouched against the counter with his phone in hand. He straightened lazily when she stepped up, barely glancing at her as she placed the box on the counter. "Evening," Valerie said with a polite smile, sliding her debit card across. He grunted something in return, swiping the box and tapping at the register. It should have been routine, 2 minutes at most. But then he frowned at the screen. His brows knit together, and he tapped again. Valerie stood patiently, assuming it was just a frozen register or a barcode that wouldn't scan. She'd been here before. These things happened. But instead of trying again, the young man leaned over to the side and waved toward the small office door just behind him. A woman stepped out, a store supervisor Valerie had seen a handful of times before but never spoken to. She was white, maybe in her late 40s, her expression tight and unsmiling. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, and peered at the register screen. "What's the problem?" she asked the clerk. "Something's not matching up," the clerk muttered, still avoiding Valerie's eyes. The woman's gaze flicked to Valerie, then back to the screen. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She typed something into the register herself, then looked at the box of medicine, then at Valerie again. Longer this time. It was the kind of look Valerie had felt before, a cold assessment that had nothing to do with her purchase and everything to do with the color of her skin. "Ma'am, there seems to be an issue with your payment information," the supervisor said, in a syrupy voice that didn't match the suspicion in her eyes. Valerie blinked, surprised. "That's strange. I've used this card here plenty of times. Can you run it again?" The woman's tone sharpened, just slightly. "I've already run it twice. The system's flagging it. We'll need to verify some details before we can complete the sale." Valerie handed over her ID without hesitation. "Here's my license. It's all current." The woman took it, but didn't look closely. She handed it back almost immediately, already shaking her head. "I think it's best if we let the authorities sort this out." Valerie stared at her, not sure she'd heard correctly. "Authorities? Over a box of cold medicine?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. "It's just, it's store policy," he mumbled. "No," Valerie said evenly, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Store policy is to resolve issues with customers directly, not call the police because of an error on your end." But the woman was already stepping away, pulling a phone from her pocket. Valerie caught the words "possible fraud" and "come quickly" before the woman disappeared into the office. A prickle ran down Valerie's spine, familiar and unwelcome. It was the same feeling she'd had years ago when a security guard followed her around a department store for 20 minutes, pretending to straighten shelves. It was the same feeling she'd had when a neighbor once called the cops on her for loitering, while she was simply waiting for her niece outside a library. That silent, invisible shift in the air when you realize someone has already decided you're guilty of something you haven't done. She could have walked out right then, left the medicine on the counter, gone home, and avoided whatever was coming next. But she knew how that would look to people like the supervisor. They would take her leaving as proof. And besides, she had done nothing wrong. She had the right to stand there in that store and expect to be treated like any other customer. Valerie straightened her shoulders, placing her hands calmly on the counter. The clerk wouldn't meet her gaze now, tapping his fingers against the register nervously. Outside, the steady hum of traffic on the main road seemed suddenly distant, muted. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Minutes passed. She checked the clock above the soda display. 7:29. Then she heard it. The faint wail of sirens in the distance. At first, she thought it might be unrelated, but as the sound grew louder, she knew they were coming here. For her. She inhaled slowly, willing herself to remain calm. If this was going to happen, she would not give them the satisfaction of fear or anger. She would not play into whatever narrative they had already written in their heads. The door chimed as it swung open, and the night air rushed in along with two uniformed officers. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression already set in a smug half-smile. Sergeant Mark Duran. The other, Officer Kyle Hastings, hung back a little, eyes flicking quickly between Duran, the supervisor, and Valerie. The supervisor wasted no time. She stepped forward, lowering her voice as though delivering a grave warning. "That's her. Tried to use mismatched payment info. I think she's using someone else's card." Duran didn't ask for the register logs. He didn't look at the medicine box. He didn't even ask Valerie a single question before stepping toward her with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who expected the world to clear a path. In that moment, Valerie knew her quiet errand for cold medicine had just turned into something else entirely. And deep down, in that place where instinct lives, she knew it wasn't going to end at the counter. The sirens hadn't even faded when the door of the convenience store swung open, letting in a gust of humid Georgia night air and two figures who carried their authority like a weapon. Sergeant Mark Duran stepped in first, tall and broad-chested, his close-cropped hair silvering at the temples, the faint smirk on his face suggesting he had already decided the ending to this story. Behind him came Officer Kyle Hastings, younger by at least 20 years, his uniform crisp, his eyes darting from side to side as though he was still learning which way to look in situations like this. They didn't pause to ask questions. They didn't scan the room for context. Duran's gaze went straight to Valerie, standing by the counter with a small box of cold medicine in front of her. It was the look of a man who believed he'd found his quarry. The store supervisor, eager to prove her own assumptions correct, stepped toward them like a stage actor hitting her mark. "That's her," she said quickly, her voice pitched low but still carrying in the near-empty store. "Tried to use mismatched payment information. I think she's using someone else's card." Hastings glanced at her, then at Valerie, then at the register. He opened his mouth, as if about to speak, but Duran cut in before he could. "Ma'am," Duran said, his voice dripping with a condescension he didn't bother to hide, "I'm going to need you to step outside with us." Valerie turned her head slowly to face him. "Why?" she asked evenly. "I haven't done anything wrong. My ID, my card, my purchase history, it's all mine." She reached into her purse with measured movements, pulled out her driver's license, her debit card, and even a worn loyalty card from the same store, with her name clearly printed across it. She placed them on the counter in a neat little line, as though laying out indisputable truth for anyone willing to see it. Duran barely glanced down. "I said, step outside," he repeated, a slight edge sharpening his tone. Hastings shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw tightening. "Sarge, maybe we should—" "We're not debating this, Hastings," Duran snapped without turning his head. The clerk behind the register had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the cold medicine box like it might explode. In the far corner, a young mother clutched her toddler's hand and made a wide arc toward the exit, whispering something hurriedly. Near the soda display, a man in work boots and a baseball cap had pulled out his phone and was already recording, holding it low but pointed directly at the unfolding scene. Valerie caught the movement out of the corner of her eye and felt a small flicker of relief. "Good," she thought. "Let them record." "I've given you my ID," Valerie said, her voice steady but firm. "You can match the name to the card, to the store account, to anything you need. There's no reason to drag me outside." Duran took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, his hand settling casually, but purposefully, on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Your choice." The store felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the buzz of the flickering neon sign outside, the child in the parking lot crying faintly as her mother hurried her to the car. Valerie's pulse was steady, but she could feel heat rising in her chest, that dangerous mix of anger and humiliation she'd worked her whole life to keep in check in moments like this. She had spent years teaching her students, especially the young black boys and girls, that dignity in the face of injustice was not weakness, but strength. And now, here she was, standing under the fluorescent glare, being treated like a criminal for daring to exist in a space where someone else had decided she didn't belong. "I'm not stepping outside unless you can tell me exactly what I'm being accused of and why," she said. The man with the phone recording shifted slightly, angling for a better view. Duran's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to Valerie. The smirk was gone now, replaced with a tight, impatient line. "Fraud. That's the accusation, and right now, refusing to comply." "It's not refusal to comply to ask for clarification," Valerie replied. Hastings stepped forward slightly, his voice low but audible. "We could just check the system, Sarge. Run the ID through." "Outside!" Duran barked, cutting him off. "Now!" The supervisor crossed her arms, her expression smug. The clerk swallowed hard and kept his eyes on the counter. The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of everyone's silence. Valerie knew she was at a crossroads. She could walk out under her own power, making it look like compliance, or she could stand her ground, knowing exactly how men like Duran interpreted that choice. But leaving without reason would feel like admitting guilt, and she would not give them that. So she stayed put. Duran's jaw flexed. He stepped forward again, and before she could move, his hand closed around her wrist. Not roughly at first, but with an unyielding grip that made his intention clear. The suddenness of it sent a ripple through the store. The man with the phone raised it higher now, camera fully visible. The mother in the corner gasped audibly. "Step! Outside!" Duran said again, this time through clenched teeth. Valerie's eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "You're making a mistake you can't undo," she said, her voice low but steady enough for the man's phone microphone to catch every word. Duran's grip tightened, and this time he pulled. Hastings shifted forward, as though to intervene, then froze. Valerie let herself be moved, not because she was giving in, but because she knew exactly what was happening now. Every second, every step, every look was being recorded. As she passed the soda display, the man filming stepped slightly closer. "We see you," he muttered under his breath. Not to her, but to the officers. Outside, the humid night wrapped around her like a damp shroud. Duran didn't release her wrist until they were at the edge of the lot, where a patrol car sat idling under another tall light pole. The harsh white light poured over the scene, bleaching the color from everything, even the blue of her dress. Hastings lingered near the store entrance, his hand flexing at his side. Duran gestured toward the back seat. "Get in," he ordered. "For cold medicine?" Valerie asked, her voice still calm but her words now razor-edged. "For fraud," Duran said flatly, though he still hadn't once examined the cards, or the medicine, or anything that might resemble evidence. Valerie turned her head slightly, looking back toward the store. Through the wide glass windows, she could see the clerk standing frozen behind the counter, the supervisor on her phone, and the man with the camera still filming, now joined by another person holding up a phone of their own. She knew then that the night wasn't going to end here in this parking lot, no matter what Duran thought. This was going to stretch far beyond the confines of a convenience store, far beyond the patrol car's back seat. The narrative he thought he controlled was slipping from his hands, one recorded second at a time. She took a slow breath and stepped toward the car, not in surrender, but in readiness. Because while Duran might think this was the end of the matter, Valerie Brooks understood it was only the beginning. The humid night air clung to Valerie's skin, the heat wrapping around her like a heavy, damp shroud as Sergeant Mark Duran tightened his grip on her wrist. She could feel the strength in his fingers, the unspoken warning in the way they dug into her skin. Not enough to bruise just yet, but enough to remind her that this was no longer a conversation. Behind him, Officer Kyle Hastings shifted again, his body language telegraphing hesitation, though his silence made him just as complicit. The engine of the patrol car purred beside them, its headlights cutting long, sharp beams across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Valerie's mind was steady, even as her pulse began to climb. She'd been in tense situations before, staff disputes at school board meetings, breaking up fights in hallways filled with teenagers ready to swing. But this was different. This wasn't a matter of tempers cooling. This was a matter of control. And Duran had already decided who the villain in his story was. She had learned long ago that once someone like him put you in that box, truth became irrelevant. She glanced back toward the store. Through the wide windows, she could see the faces pressed near the glass. The young man with the phone still had it raised, lens locked on her. Another bystander, a middle-aged woman in a red sweatshirt, had pulled out her phone too, her expression grim, determined. In the far corner, the store supervisor stood with her arms folded, lips curved into something between satisfaction and self-righteousness. Duran yanked her forward, and Valerie stumbled half a step before regaining her balance. "Keep moving," he ordered. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice calm, clear. "Then don't make this harder than it needs to be," he shot back. The words were like script, lines spoken 1,000 times in 1,000 confrontations, just like this one. Valerie knew them well. They weren't meant to de-escalate. They were meant to imply that whatever happened next would be her fault. When they reached the back door of the patrol car, Duran spun her toward it, his grip tightening. She felt the cool bite of metal before she heard the first click of the handcuffs. The sound was louder than she expected in the quiet of the lot. Sharp, final, echoing. Her breath stayed steady. She didn't jerk away, didn't twist or pull. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin just enough so that her voice would carry when she spoke. "You're making a mistake you can't undo," she said. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't defiant in the way he might have expected. It was simply stated, like fact. And in that moment, she saw something flicker across Duran's face. Not doubt, but a brief flash of irritation. The kind that comes when someone refuses to play the role you've assigned them. The words carried farther than she realized. The man with the phone outside the store lowered it for just a second to murmur to the woman beside him, "She's right." Then he lifted it again, framing the shot so the camera caught her face, her cuffs, and the officer's hand gripping her arm. Duran guided, no, pushed her toward the open door. She bent slightly to slide in, feeling the edge of the seat against the backs of her legs, the stale smell of old vinyl and sweat rising from the interior. The cuffs bit into her wrists as she maneuvered herself inside, and she couldn't stop the small wince that passed over her face. The door shut with a metallic thud that vibrated through her, sealing her into a small, airless space. From her position in the back seat, she could still see Hastings lingering by the store entrance. His weight was on his heels now, his arms loose at his sides, eyes locked on the ground. He looked like a man who wanted to say something, but had convinced himself it wouldn't make a difference. Inside the store, customers were no longer pretending to shop. They were openly watching, filming, whispering. Every second of it was being captured. Her calm voice, the click of the cuffs, the way she was led away without raising her voice or her hands. Valerie knew how this would play out in the right hands online. The footage wouldn't just tell a story, it would show one. And that mattered. Duran slid into the driver's seat, his movements brisk, efficient. He didn't look back at her. "We'll sort this out downtown," he said, his tone making it clear that in his mind, there was nothing to sort. Valerie didn't respond. She sat as straight as she could in the cramped space, letting her breathing settle, letting the reality of the moment sink in without swallowing her whole. She thought about her students, how many times she'd told them to keep their composure, to let the truth speak for itself. She thought about her mother, who'd once told her that some fights were won not by shouting, but by standing so still the other person couldn't ignore your presence. The car began to roll forward, the tires crunching over loose gravel at the edge of the lot. Valerie kept her gaze fixed out the window. She watched as the store grew smaller in the glass, the faces at the window becoming indistinct shapes. But even as they receded from view, she knew the moment wasn't fading. It was multiplying, being saved to camera rolls, uploaded to social media, shared with friends and strangers alike. At the first stoplight, Duran reached up to adjust the rearview mirror, catching her eyes in the reflection. He held her gaze for a second, maybe two, then looked away. Hastings sat in silence in the passenger seat, his profile stiff, unreadable. Valerie shifted her wrists slightly, feeling the metal pinch, the skin already tender beneath it. She let her eyes close for half a heartbeat, not in surrender, but in something like centering. Whatever came next, questions, booking, holding cells, she would face it with the same steady calm she had here in the parking lot. She opened her eyes again and caught sight of the neon glow of another store sign passing by. The ordinary world was still out there, people buying snacks, filling gas tanks, going about their nights unaware of the small storm that had just begun in the corner of their city. But that storm was moving now, and she was in the center of it. When they turned onto the main road, the sound of a siren rose somewhere far behind them, not their own, but close enough to vibrate faintly through the frame of the car. Valerie thought about the man with the phone, the woman in the red sweatshirt, the silent witnesses inside the store. She didn't know their names, but she knew at least some of them would share what they'd seen. She leaned back against the seat, the vinyl squeaking under her. The metal cuffs pressed harder into her wrists as the car hit a bump, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she thought again of the words she'd spoken. "You're making a mistake you can't undo." She meant them, and somewhere deep down, she suspected that before this was over, Sergeant Mark Duran would understand just how right she was. The ride to the precinct was only 12 minutes, but it stretched in Valerie's mind like a long, unlit hallway with no clear end. The low hum of the patrol car's engine was broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio and the faint sound of Duran's steady breathing in the driver's seat. Hastings rode shotgun, his eyes fixed out the window, the blur of passing streetlights painting his face in alternating stripes of shadow and pale yellow. Neither man looked at her. Neither spoke to her. She sat upright in the back, her hands cuffed behind her, the metal digging deeper with each small shift of the car, the air stale and faintly tinged with the scent of sweat and something chemical. Bleach, maybe. When they pulled into the station's lot, the building loomed ahead, its brick facade washed in the cold glow of fluorescent floodlights. The precinct had the kind of tired, worn-down exterior that told a story of decades of footsteps in and out, hundreds of late nights, thousands of cases processed. Some just, many not. Duran parked with a quick jerk of the wheel, cutting the engine in one smooth motion. He stepped out without a word, rounding the car to open her door. His hand clamped on her arm again, not violently, but with the proprietary touch of someone who thought possession of a person was part of his job. "Let's go," he said as though she'd been dawdling. Valerie stepped out, feeling the curious weight of eyes on her almost immediately. Officers lingered near the entrance, sipping coffee from paper cups, talking in low voices. Their conversations paused, however briefly, as she walked past. No one asked who she was. No one asked what happened. Their glances were quick, assessing, and dismissive, like they'd already filed her away in their mental catalog of the guilty. Inside, the air was cooler, but carried the unmistakable scent of old paper, stale coffee, and industrial-strength cleaner. The walls were painted a sickly shade of beige, their surfaces marred by years of scuffs and faded bulletin board notices curling at the corners. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered in the kind of rhythm that made your eyes ache if you stared too long. Duran steered her toward the booking desk. The sergeant on duty there was heavy-set, his thinning hair combed in deliberate lines across his scalp, his expression blank except for a faint spark of curiosity when he looked up from his clipboard. Duran spoke before Valerie could. "Suspected fraud," he announced, his tone carrying just enough volume for the handful of nearby officers to hear. Caught her trying to use someone else's payment info at the corner mart. The desk sergeant glanced at her for a fraction of a second, eyes flicking from her face to the handcuffs on her wrists, then looked back at his paperwork. "Name? Valerie Brooks," Duran replied, answering for her. He rattled off her age, race, and address with the clinical detachment of a man ordering coffee. Valerie stood still, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She had no illusions about the value of speaking up here. This was their domain, their territory, and her voice, no matter how measured or reasonable, would be treated as background noise at best, defiance at worst. The desk sergeant tapped something into his computer, then gestured for Duran to move her along. Mug shot, fingerprints, then holding. The camera flash hit her eyes like a punch, leaving behind ghost spots in her vision. It was quick, mechanical. Stand here, turn slightly, look this way, like they were photographing an object, not a person. Then came the fingerprinting, her cuffed hands freed only long enough to be rolled in black ink and pressed firmly onto a cold, hard surface. The officer doing it didn't meet her eyes, his grip impersonal but firm, as though she might run if given the chance. When the cuffs clicked back into place, she flexed her fingers against the sting, the faint stickiness of drying ink clinging to her skin. Duran noticed the motion and smirked, leaning in slightly. "Get used to that feeling," he murmured, low enough that Hastings, standing a few feet away, might not hear. She didn't react. She'd spent years in classrooms holding her composure in the face of far less dangerous, but equally cutting remarks. She knew when to respond, and when silence could be the sharper weapon. Hastings' avoidance was almost palpable now. He lingered in her peripheral vision, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the far wall. She could feel the discomfort radiating from him, though whether it was guilt or just the awkwardness of a rookie caught between his conscience and his loyalty, she couldn't tell. The walk to the holding cell was a slow procession down a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The sound of her footsteps echoed against the tile, joined by the steady thud of Duran's boots behind her. Occasionally, voices drifted from behind the doors, snippets of conversations, laughter, the muted clink of a coffee mug being set down. When they reached the cell, Duran unlocked the door with a metallic scrape and guided her inside. The room was small, barely wider than her outstretched arms, with a single cold metal bench bolted to one wall. The floor was scuffed, the corners shadowed. The air smelled faintly of bleach, but underneath it was the sour tang of stale sweat and the faint metallic scent of the bars themselves. The door closed behind her with a hollow clang that seemed to reverberate in her chest. Duran leaned against the bars, his fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm against the metal. "You want to make this easier on yourself?" he asked, that smirk still curling his mouth. She met his gaze without blinking. "I already told you," she said evenly. "I've done nothing wrong." His smirk widened slightly, though there was no humor in it. "We'll see about that." From down the hall, a faint burst of laughter erupted, followed by the sound of footsteps moving away. The fluorescent light above her flickered, casting the room into momentary shadow before buzzing back to life. Valerie lowered herself onto the bench, her movements slow, deliberate. She folded her hands in her lap, wrists still bound, her posture straight. She would not slouch, she would not hunch, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her small. She knew the power here was not in shouting her innocence, but in refusing to let them strip away her presence, her dignity. Whatever came next, the hours of waiting, the questions loaded with accusation, the paperwork already filled with their version of events, she would meet it the same way she had met Duran's smirk in the parking lot, with steady eyes and silence that spoke louder than any argument could, In the shadows of the precinct, with every glance cast her way dripping with presumption, Valerie understood something vital. She wasn't just up against one officer's prejudice or one supervisor's bias. She was inside the machinery that ran on it. And tonight, that machinery had turned its full attention on her. But she also knew something else. Machines break. The minutes in the holding cell stretched out like hours, each one marked by the buzzing flicker of the overhead light and the occasional shuffle of boots in the hallway. Valerie sat on the cold metal bench, her wrists still cuffed, her posture unyielding. She had no idea what time it was now. Her watch and phone had been taken, but she guessed it had been at least 40 minutes since Duran had left her here with his smirk and his promise to see about that. No one had come to ask her a question. No one had offered her water. The silence wasn't neglect. It was intentional, a tool meant to grind down her patience and her composure. Then the air in the hallway shifted. She didn't hear anything at first, just sensed it, like a change in pressure before a storm. The low murmur of casual conversation at the booking desk went quiet. The sound of boots approached, slow and deliberate. Not the lazy saunter of an officer on night shift, but the precise cadence of someone walking in with purpose. When the voices came, they weren't familiar. The first was calm, measured, but carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its volume to be heard. "Who's in charge here?" The desk sergeant's voice followed, higher, almost stumbling. That would be me, sir." "Good," the first voice replied, sharper now. "Then you can explain why my sister is in a holding cell without cause." Valerie's head lifted. She knew that voice. It had been years since she'd heard it in person, but she could never mistake it. Henry Brooks, her older brother. The footsteps drew closer, joined by two others. When they came into view, they filled the hallway like a wall moving toward her cell. Henry walked in the middle, taller than she remembered, his once black hair now salt and pepper, his suit pressed sharp even at this hour. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers for a fraction of a second, and in that glance she felt something settle inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. On either side of him were two federal agents in dark suits, earpieces coiled neatly at their collars. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was a statement. This was no family visit. This was an intervention. Henry stopped in front of the cell, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the cuffs, the bench, the tight set of her shoulders. His jaw flexed, but his voice, when it came, was even and precise. "Open it," he said to the sergeant, who had followed behind. "Sir, we can't just—" "Yes, you can," Henry interrupted, turning toward him with the slow precision of a man who had dismantled people in courtrooms for decades. "And you will, unless you'd like to explain to the Department of Justice why you're detaining a U.S. citizen without probable cause, without booking, without reading her rights, and without logging a single piece of evidence to justify her arrest." The sergeant's mouth opened, then closed. One of the federal agents stepped forward, producing a slim black folder from under his arm. "We've reviewed the preliminary incident," the agent said, his tone clipped. "Procedural violations are evident. No verification of ID, no attempt to confirm the alleged fraud before detainment, no probable cause established. This case is now under federal civil rights review, effective immediately." Down the hall, the murmur of voices from other officers began again. Quieter now, urgent. Valerie could feel the change ripple through the building. The casual confidence of a local police department, sure of its own insulation, was faltering. The scent of their certainty was fading, replaced by something sharper. Unease. Henry didn't take his eyes off the sergeant. "You have two choices right now. Unlock this cell, remove those cuffs, and begin cooperating with the federal investigation. or continue down the path you're on and explain to a grand jury why you thought the 4th and 14th Amendments were optional tonight. The sergeant swallowed, his hand drifting reluctantly to the ring of keys at his belt. There was a metallic scrape as he turned the lock. The door swung open, its hinges groaning like they'd been holding their breath. Henry stepped back just enough to give Valerie the space to walk out on her own. She stood slowly, letting the motion carry its full weight, the cuffs still digging into her wrists. One of the agents moved in, producing another key, and with 2 sharp clicks, the metal restraints were gone. She rubbed her wrists briefly, not to soothe the sting, but to mark the moment, the transition from their control to her own. Henry's voice dropped lower, meant only for her. "You all right?" "I am now," she said. Duran appeared at the far end of the hallway, his swagger a little less certain than before. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Henry turned toward him, his expression cooling another degree. "What's going on," he said evenly, "is that you are now a subject in a federal investigation into civil rights violations. You will surrender any and all body cam footage from tonight, unedited. You will provide every report you've filed in the last 24 hours. And you will not, under any circumstances, have contact with my sister again unless directed through counsel." Duran's jaw worked, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't step closer. His gaze flicked to the agents, then to the sergeant, and for the first time that night, Valerie saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not disdain, but calculation. He was weighing his options, and for once, he didn't seem certain of the outcome. One of the agents handed Henry a document, which he passed to the sergeant. "This is the formal notice," Henry said, "signed and authorized. This precinct will now cooperate fully with the DOJ. Failure to do so will result in immediate federal intervention beyond what's already in place." The sergeant took the paper like it might burn him. Henry glanced at Valerie, then gestured toward the hallway. "Let's go." She walked beside him, the 2 agents flanking them as they moved past the booking desk. Every pair of eyes in the room followed them, some openly hostile, some wary, some simply stunned. At the main doors, Henry paused just long enough to address the room without turning. "This is far from over," he said, his voice carrying like a closing argument. "You've built a culture here that treats certain people as guilty the moment they walk through the door. That changes now." Then they stepped out into the night, the humid air wrapping around them again. But this time, it felt different. Cleaner, somehow. The station doors shut behind them with a finality that made Valerie's shoulders ease for the first time in hours. She looked at her brother, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly. "You didn't waste any time." Henry's answering smile was thin, edged with something colder. "I don't waste time when it's my family," he said. "And when it's justice, I don't waste time for anyone." The change inside the precinct was immediate, almost physical, as if someone had cracked open a sealed jar and let in a rush of cold air. Moments after Henry walked Valerie out into the humid Georgia night, the 2 federal agents who had flanked him returned inside. Not to chat, not to observe, but to work. They moved with the precision of people who already knew where to look and what to find. Within minutes, they had a workstation set up at the booking desk, a laptop open, cables snaking across the counter, and a small black device connected directly into the precinct's internal network. "Body cam footage," one agent said, her tone flat but carrying. "Every officer on duty tonight, from the start of shift to now. No edits, no gaps. Pull it up." The desk sergeant hesitated, his hands frozen over his keyboard, until the agent's eyes cut to him like a scalpel. He began typing. Across the room, another agent was already flipping through thick manila folders, internal affairs files, complaint logs, disciplinary records. Some were stamped closed in red ink, others unsubstantiated. But the agent didn't seem interested in the official conclusions. He was looking for patterns. It didn't take long for murmurs to ripple through the building. The kind of whispers that said, "This isn't just about one arrest anymore." Officers exchanged glances, the easy swagger that had filled the air earlier replaced by something tighter, more guarded. The younger ones checked their phones obsessively, some slipping into corners to send hurried messages. The older ones sat still, shoulders squared but eyes following the agent's every move. Down the main hallway, Sergeant Mark Duran stood in the doorway of a side office, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was watching, but he wasn't intervening. For once, the man who had controlled every step of Valerie's arrest wasn't in control at all. Outside, the night had taken on a different energy. Valerie and Henry stood near the curb as two more black SUVs pulled into the lot, disgorging additional DOJ staff, analysts, a media liaison, and an evidence technician carrying a case the size of a small suitcase. From the sidewalk across the street, voices began to rise. At first, it was just a handful of people. Those who had been inside the store earlier, a few passers-by who had stopped when they saw the patrol car, but they were quickly joined by others. Word had spread faster than gasoline catching flame. And that was because the video was already out. Somewhere between the moment Valerie was cuffed in the parking lot and the time she was released from the cell, the man with the phone in the soda aisle had posted it to social media. By the time she stepped out of the station, it had been shared hundreds of times locally, tagged with phrases like "San Sais, Justice for Valerie," and "Tan Cornermart Arrest." Within the hour, those shares had multiplied into the thousands. The footage wasn't grainy, wasn't distant. It was clear, steady, and damning. It showed Valerie at the counter, her voice calm and clear, offering her ID and cards. It showed Duran ignoring her documentation, telling her to step outside. It showed his hand gripping her wrist and the click of the cuffs. And it caught her words perfectly, the ones that hung in the air like a prophecy. "You're making a mistake you can't undo." By midnight, the clip had crossed into national circulation. A local news anchor played it at the top of the hour. Then an Atlanta station picked it up. By morning, one of the largest cable networks would be running it on a loop alongside a headshot of Valerie from her teaching job, framing it as the latest example in a long line of questionable arrests involving race, authority, and abuse of power. Back inside the precinct, the agents weren't just pulling tonight's body cam files, they were pulling years of them. A separate request had already been submitted for archived footage, officer complaint histories, and internal memos. In one small conference room, a DOJ tech specialist was feeding disks into a reader, the footage appearing on a bank of monitors. Duran at a traffic stop, his voice raised, Hastings at a convenience store call months earlier, his posture tense, but his voice low. Other officers in other moments, each time stamped and catalogued. It was tedious work, but it was also surgical. Every clip that contradicted policy, every incident where procedure wasn't followed, every piece of evidence that suggested a pattern of behavior, they were all being marked, copied, and stored in a secure federal drive. The complaint records told their own story. There were allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, unlawful searches. Many had been marked resolved or no finding. But the agents weren't interested in the department's conclusions. They were interested in the frequency of names, the repetition of certain phrases, the way reports seemed to vanish for months, only to reappear with heavily edited language. By 2 in the morning, the precinct's atmosphere had shifted entirely. The casual banter was gone. The only voices belonged to agents issuing instructions, or officers answering questions they clearly wished they could avoid. The desk sergeant's hands trembled slightly as he printed out a set of access logs. A lieutenant sat with an agent in one of the interview rooms, his voice carrying faintly through the thin wall. "I don't know anything about that." Over and over again. Henry, standing just inside the front doors, watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd spent decades fighting systems exactly like this one. Valerie, beside him, said little. She didn't need to speak to feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every name in those files, every face in those videos, every person who had walked into this station and been treated as less than human. From outside, the crowd had doubled, then tripled. There were homemade signs now. "Stop the abuse. We see you. Justice for all." A group of local college students had arrived with megaphones, leading chants that echoed faintly, even through the thick glass of the station's entrance. Camera crews set up along the sidewalk, their lights cutting through the dark, the red tally dots on their equipment glowing like watchful eyes. Every time the front doors opened, whether for an officer stepping out for a smoke or an agent heading to one of the SUVs, the chants grew louder. Some officers flinched at the sound. Others kept their faces carefully blank, but their shoulders told another story. In the early hours of the morning, one of the agents approached Henry. "We've got enough to move this beyond an incident review," she said, her voice low. "We're recommending a full-scale federal investigation into this department's practices." Henry nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Good. Don't stop until you've turned over every stone." Valerie didn't ask how long it would take, or how deep it would go. She already knew the answer. As long as it needed to, and as deep as it could. And as the crowd outside swelled again, drawn by the glow of live news trucks, the hum of outrage, and the undeniable proof captured in a 2-minute video, she realized something else. The machinery that had closed around her hours earlier was no longer just grinding her down. It was being dismantled, piece by piece, by people who knew how to take apart a system and show the country what was inside. Tonight, the scrutiny wasn't just on her. It was on them. And for the first time since Duran's hand had clamped around her wrist in that store, she felt the balance shifting. By mid-morning, less than 12 hours after Valerie had walked out of the precinct beside her brother, the story had grown beyond her name. News vans still lined the sidewalk, reporters leaning into their microphones with the urgency of people who knew the country was watching. The crowd from the night before had thinned slightly, but in its place came a new wave. People carrying folders, photographs, and worn manila envelopes filled with documents. They weren't here to protest. They were here to be heard. Some of them came forward quietly, approaching Henry or one of the federal agents, with eyes darting nervously toward the station's front doors. Others arrived in small groups, holding each other's hands or standing shoulder to shoulder. They had different stories, different ages, different races, but one thread ran through all their accounts: the same department, the same kind of treatment, the same dismissal when they tried to complain. It was in this swirl of testimony and television cameras that a woman in a slate-gray suit stepped out of the crowd and approached Valerie. She moved like someone accustomed to rooms where every second counted. Confident, economical, and with her gaze fixed exactly where she intended it. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice warm but direct. "I'm Elena Marquez, civil rights attorney. I've been following what happened to you." Valerie studied her for a moment. Elena was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a low bun, and the kind of composure that didn't falter in the presence of microphones or uniforms. There was something in her eyes, steady, assessing, that reminded Valerie of her best students, the ones who had learned how to read a room before they opened their mouths. "I think you know what this is," Elena continued, holding out a thin folder. "What happened to you isn't isolated. It's systemic. And right now, the door is open in a way it almost never is. If you're willing, I'd like you to serve as the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against this department. Valerie didn't take the folder immediately. A lawsuit? Yes, Elena said simply. Not just for you, for everyone who's been through what you've been through, and worse. We've already got nearly 24 documented cases. I expect more will come forward now that they've seen you stand your ground. Henry, standing nearby, didn't interrupt, though Valerie could feel his attention sharpen. I'm not... Valerie hesitated, searching for the right words. I'm not an activist. I teach kids. You don't have to be an activist, Elena cut in gently. You just have to be willing to tell the truth. And to let your name open the door for people whose stories were ignored, until now. The noise of the crowd seemed to dim for a moment, replaced by the sound of a woman's voice nearby. Older, quavering, but strong in its insistence. I told them my son didn't fit the description. They didn't listen. They never listen. Valerie turned toward the sound. A woman in her 70s stood clutching a worn photograph of a young man in a graduation cap and gown. Her voice caught as she spoke to one of the federal agents, explaining how her son had been stopped walking home from work and spent 2 nights in holding without charge. Next to her, a man in his 30s described being pulled over for a broken taillight and ending up face down on the pavement with a knee in his back. Another woman talked about being shoved against a wall in the very same station behind them. None of them had been able to prove their cases, until now, perhaps. Elena waited until Valerie's eyes returned to her. This isn't about whether you wanted this role. It's about whether you're willing to use the moment you didn't ask for to change something bigger than you. Valerie exhaled slowly. She thought of the cuffs on her wrists, the sound of the cell door closing, the way Duran's voice had carried that lazy certainty that nothing she did could matter. She thought of her students, the faces she saw every day, some of them already learning the unspoken rules of how to survive encounters with authority. And she thought about the night before, the strangers in the store who'd pulled out their phones, the crowd outside the station chanting for her release, the clip of her arrest playing on loop across the country. She hadn't chosen to be here, but here she was, and the question now wasn't whether she wanted the fight. It was whether she could walk away from it knowing others would take the same blows she had. Tell me what it would mean, she said finally. Elena opened the folder, revealing pages of names, incident summaries, and photographs. It means your name goes first. It means we file not just for damages, but for structural change, independent oversight, mandatory bias training, external review of all use-of-force incidents, and a public database of complaints. It means they don't get to bury this in a file cabinet and move on. Valerie flipped through the pages, stopping at a photo of a young woman with a split lip and bruises along her cheekbone. The summary beneath it was brief. Traffic stop. Alleged non-compliance. No charges filed. She didn't need the rest of the details to understand what had happened. I'll do it, Valerie said quietly. A flicker of relief passed over Elena's face, though her tone stayed steady. Good. We'll get the paperwork started. I'll walk you through every step. Henry's hand came to rest briefly on Valerie's shoulder. You're making the right call, he said. By that afternoon, the announcement was official. Elena stood beside Valerie on the courthouse steps, microphones bristling in front of them, cameras clicking in a steady rhythm. The crowd behind them had grown again, signs and banners lifting above the sea of faces. My client, Elena said, gesturing to Valerie, was wrongfully detained, humiliated, and denied her rights. But she is not alone. We have collected evidence from dozens of others who have experienced similar abuse at the hands of this department. Today, we begin a class action suit demanding accountability, transparency, and reform. Valerie stepped forward, the sun warm on her face, the lenses of 100 cameras trained on her. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice steady. "But neither did any of the people standing here with me. What happened to me happens to too many, too often. I can't change what happened last night. But maybe, if we push, if we stay loud, we can change what happens next time." The cheers rose up from the crowd, spilling down the courthouse steps and into the street. Valerie felt the sound in her chest, a vibration that seemed to settle into her bones. She still didn't see herself as an activist, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes you didn't have to declare a role for it to claim you. And sometimes that role could become the thing that turned one night's injustice into a movement no one could ignore. The lawsuit hit the department like a sledgehammer. In the first week after Elena filed the class action suit, the city tried to downplay it, releasing a carefully worded statement calling Valerie's arrest an unfortunate misunderstanding and insisting the department was committed to transparency. But the federal investigation didn't wait for press releases to run their course. The agents were still in the station every day, pulling files, cross-checking incident reports, and sitting officers down for interviews under oath. Each document they unearthed, each discrepancy they found, tightened the noose around the department's long-cultivated culture of impunity. By the third week, the cracks began to show. A leaked memo from the mayor's office revealed that federal investigators had flagged over 100 unresolved citizen complaints in the past 10 years. Many of them eerily similar to Valerie's arrest, minor infractions or unverified claims, escalating into detainment or violence, disproportionately affecting black residents. The memo also named a handful of officers who had amassed more than a dozen complaints each without consequence. Two of those names, Mark Duran and Kyle Hastings, were at the top of the list. The public outrage that had flared after Valerie's video now burned hotter. Protesters camped outside City Hall with signs demanding resignations. Editorials in the local paper called the department a liability to the city's moral and financial health. The mayor, who had initially defended the chief of police, began to distance himself, describing the situation as untenable. Behind closed doors, it was Henry and the DOJ who were setting the terms. The tipping point came on a rainy Thursday morning when the police chief, a man who had served in the role for 12 years, stepped up to a podium in the department's briefing room. The room was packed with reporters, their umbrellas dripping onto the carpet. His uniform looked crisp, but his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Effective immediately," he said, "I am resigning from my position as chief of police." He offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the investigation, only a quick retreat from the microphone before the shouted questions could catch him. The same afternoon, the department announced the suspension of 6 officers without pay pending the outcome of the federal inquiry. Among them were Duran and Hastings. For the first time, the public heard the formal charges they were facing: civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, and unlawful arrest. The indictment documents, dry in language but devastating in implication, outlined how Duran had ignored clear evidence of Valerie's identity and lawful purchase, escalated without cause, and submitted an arrest report that omitted the existence of her offered identification entirely. Hastings was charged for aiding and abetting the unlawful arrest and for signing off on a falsified report. The department's public relations machine spun furiously. A spokesperson emphasized that these charges reflect the actions of individuals, not the department as a whole. But the city council had already moved past defending the institution. They voted unanimously to approve an emergency package of reforms drafted in consultation with the DOJ and Elena's legal team. The package was sweeping. Every officer, from rookies to senior brass, would be required to complete annual racial bias training conducted by an independent organization. not an in-house seminar designed to check a box. An independent oversight board, composed of community members, civil rights experts, and retired judges, would have full authority to review use of force incidents, misconduct complaints, and body cam footage. And perhaps most damning to the old guard, the city ordered a 10-year review of all misconduct complaints, with findings to be made public and actionable. When the reforms were announced, the plaza outside City Hall filled with hundreds of people. Valerie stood with Henry, Elena, and several other plaintiffs from the class action suit on a temporary stage as the mayor read the resolution aloud. The crowd erupted in cheers at each measure, their voices echoing off the glass and steel of the surrounding buildings. It was a victory, yes, but it wasn't without resistance. Within the department, a faction of officers grumbled about political witch hunts and outsiders meddling in our work. Anonymous flyers appeared in break rooms warning that morale is collapsing and good cops are being thrown under the bus. But these protests of innocence were undercut by the steady drumbeat of evidence emerging from the federal review. Body cam footage showing questionable arrests, audio of officers mocking civilians in custody, records of repeat offenders shielded by their superiors. The criminal cases against Duran and Hastings moved quickly, fueled by the video evidence from the store and the contradictions between their reports and the footage. In pretrial hearings, the prosecution laid out a timeline so airtight it left their defense attorneys fumbling for alternative explanations. A judge denied their motions to dismiss, citing overwhelming probable cause. Valerie attended one of the hearings, sitting quietly in the second row. She didn't look away when Duran entered in a suit instead of a uniform, his posture still stiff, but his eyes darting more than before. Hastings glanced at her once, then looked down at the table in front of him. The media kept the story alive, not just because of Valerie's presence, but because the case had become a symbol of something larger. A rare moment when the machinery of accountability, so often stalled, was actually grinding forward. National outlets ran side-by-side timelines, Valerie's arrest in one column, the resulting reforms in the other, framing it as proof that exposure, persistence, and public pressure could force change. By the end of the summer, the city's police department was almost unrecognizable from the one that had cuffed Valerie in a convenience store. The Oversight Board was already reviewing its first batch of misconduct cases. Officers were attending their initial bias training sessions, and the mayor had appointed an interim chief known for his work in community policing. The federal investigation was still active, but its preliminary findings had already validated what Valerie and so many others had said for years. This was not a series of isolated mistakes, but a system that had been allowed to operate without meaningful checks. On a warm September evening, Valerie returned to the same convenience store where it had all started. The aisles were the same, the hum of the refrigerator cases unchanged. The clerk at the counter recognized her immediately and offered an awkward smile. "Glad they finally saw the truth," he said quietly. She nodded, not out of satisfaction, but acknowledgement. The truth had been seen, but the work wasn't over. As she stepped back into the fading sunlight, she could still hear Elena's words from that first meeting. "You just have to be willing to tell the truth." Now, the city had listened. The country had listened. And somewhere, in another town, someone else was pressing record on their phone, refusing to let another story be buried. The trial of Sergeant Mark Duran and Officer Kyle Hastings stretched for 3 long weeks, every detail dissected under the bright lights of the courtroom. Witness after witness took the stand. Bystanders from the store, federal investigators, even the clerk who had first called the police. The video of Valerie's arrest was played so many times it became burned into the minds of everyone present. Each replay stripped away another layer of the department's defense, until there was nothing left but the truth. There had been no fraud, no threat, no justification. Only the reflexive exertion of power against someone who refused to look guilty when she wasn't. The prosecution's closing argument was crisp and devastating. "This is not a misunderstanding," the lead prosecutor told the jury. "It is a choice, an abuse of authority, followed by a deliberate falsification of the record to protect that abuse." When the jury returned after just 5 hours of deliberation, the verdicts were read in a courtroom so silent that Valerie could hear the judge's pen scratching against the sentencing papers. "Guilty," the foreperson said for each charge: civil rights violations, falsifying reports, unlawful arrest. Duran's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Hastings stared straight ahead, his face pale. The judge sentenced them both to prison terms, Duran to 5 years, Hastings to 2, and ordered them barred from any future law enforcement role in the state. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. News outlets broadcast the moment live, showing people embracing, raising their fists, and chanting Valerie's name alongside calls for broader justice. Reporters swarmed her, microphones thrust forward, voices competing for a quote that could cap the story. Valerie stepped to the podium set up on the courthouse steps, her hands resting lightly on the wood. The sun was high, the air sharp with autumn coolness, and the plaza was packed with faces. Some she recognized from the protests, others who had joined along the way. Cameras from national networks sat shoulder to shoulder with those from local stations, their red lights blinking. "This verdict is a step," she began, her voice steady but carrying. "It's a start, not an end. Because convictions don't erase the harm done. They don't undo the nights spent in cells, the trust broken, the dignity stripped. They don't bring back the lives that could have gone another way if justice had arrived when it should have." The crowd quieted, hanging on each word. "We can't afford to believe that today closes this chapter," she continued. "If anything, it turns the page to one where the work is harder, because now the system knows we're watching. And when they know we're watching, they get smarter about hiding what they do. That means we have to be smarter, louder, and unwilling to let them go back to business as usual." Elena stood just behind her, nodding faintly. Henry was on the other side, his arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd like he was still guarding his sister. Valerie took a breath, her eyes sweeping over the people gathered. "I've learned something in these months. Dignity is not something the system grants you. It's something you already have, something no one can take away unless you give it to them. And if you hold on to it, quietly, firmly, they have to reckon with it. They have to see it. And eventually, they have to answer for what they've done to it." The applause began at the edges of the crowd, spreading inward until it became a roar. But Valerie didn't smile. This wasn't the kind of moment for victory laps. In the weeks that followed, she didn't retreat into her classroom and close the door on the world. She joined reform groups that had once been little more than small gatherings in community centers. She spoke at town halls, universities, and church basements. She sat in policy meetings with city officials who now returned her calls on the first ring. And she kept showing up at the oversight board sessions, listening to cases that sounded all too familiar. People stopped without cause, searched without consent, spoken to like criminals in their own neighborhoods. Everywhere she went, people approached her, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with grief. One young man told her he'd decided to apply to law school because of her case. A mother in her 40s pressed her hand and said she finally had the courage to file a complaint she'd been holding back for years. An elderly veteran simply nodded at her in silence, the gesture saying more than words could. But there were also moments that reminded her how fragile progress could be. In one meeting, She listened as a city council member tried to water down a new policy requiring officers to release body cam footage within 30 days. In another, she heard whispers about budget cuts to the bias training program. She understood then that the system didn't just resist change. It waited, patient, for the moment when the public's attention drifted. So she made it her mission to keep that attention focused. She partnered with local journalists to track the oversight board's cases. She started a series of public forums called Not Over Yet, where community members could share their encounters with the department and strategize about next steps. She met with activists in other cities, connecting them to Elena and Henry, building a network that stretched far beyond the borders of her own. There were days when the weight of it pressed heavy on her. The court case was over, but the fight had only grown. Still, she remembered the cell's cold bench, the click of the cuffs, the certainty in Duran's voice that she was powerless. And she knew that every meeting, every speech, every name she learned at those forums was another strike against the kind of certainty that had once defined this city's police force. Nearly a year after the verdict, she stood in front of a crowd at a rally marking the anniversary of her arrest. The air was warm, the plaza alive with music, chants, and signs. She looked out over the people, faces new and familiar, a living reminder that movements aren't sustained by single moments, but by the people who refuse to let them fade. "I told you this was a start," she said into the microphone, "and it still is, because the only way we win is if we never let the start become the end." The cheers rolled over her like a wave. Somewhere in the crowd, a teenager lifted a handmade sign high above his head. It read, "We're still watching." And Valerie knew. That was exactly what the system feared most. What happened to Valerie Brooks is more than one woman's story. It's a lesson for every American citizen. In just 5 minutes, a routine errand turned into a public humiliation. In just one night, a false arrest was exposed for the whole country to see. And in less than 1 year, that single injustice sparked a movement, forced resignations, and reshaped a police department that had been unchecked for more than 10 years. But here's the truth. Change like this doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't last without constant pressure. Power never gives up power willingly. It has to be held accountable, over and over again. That means recording when you see wrongdoing. That means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable. That means demanding answers from your leaders, not once, but every single time they try to sidestep the truth. Valerie's case shows us that dignity isn't something the system grants. It's something you carry, something no one can take away unless you let them. And when ordinary people hold on to that dignity and refuse to back down, even the most entrenched systems have to answer for their actions. But the fight doesn't end with a guilty verdict or a new policy. It begins there. The system counts on us forgetting, moving on, or getting tired. Don't give them that. Remember this case when you see news of another injustice. Remember how fast the crowd grew outside that station, how the video spread across the country, how public pressure turned into reform. That is citizen power in action. If you want a country where your children, your friends, and your neighbors can walk into a store without fear, where no one is above the law, and where dignity is not negotiable, then you have a role to play. Stay alert. Stay involved. Stay loud. This is how change is made, by refusing to look away, refusing to stay silent, and refusing to let business as usual return. And if Valerie's story has moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of what's at stake, don't let it end here. Watch to the very end. Hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with everyone you know. Because this is not just a story, it's a blueprint. And America needs as many people as possible ready to follow it.